coming to the library tonight. My name is Andrea Rounds. I'm the library director. It's so nice to see all of you. We are here tonight with Rick Beyers. He is a New York Times bestselling author and award-winning documentary filmmaker. His most recent book, Rivals Unto Death, is a compelling new account of the fateful rivalry of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. He wrote and produced the PBS documentary The Ghost Army, which tells the story of an extraordinary World War II unit that used inflatable tanks, sound effects, and illusion to fool Hitler's legions on the battlefields of Europe. Beyers also co-authored a best-selling book on the unit, The Ghost Army of World War II, with Elizabeth Sales, that is being developed as a Hollywood movie. He is the president of the Ghost Army Legacy Project, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving and honoring the legacy of the deception troops. Thank you very much for making the trip down here. I really appreciate you coming down, and I'm so excited for the talk. So I think we're all in for a treat. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Glad to be here. You know, I've never been to Whitman before. I didn't really know what Whitman was going to be like, so naturally I wanted to be prepared for all eventualities. 7:30 a.m., Wednesday morning, July 11th, 1804, Aaron Burr stood on a clearing below the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, holding a pistol, just so. 30 feet away, holding an identical pistol, stood Alexander Hamilton. The same two pistols had been used in the exact same location in a duel that killed Hamilton's son 3 years earlier. On this morning, Burr watched with icy disdain as Hamilton fiddled with his glasses, briefly holding up the proceedings. Burr thought he read fear in Hamilton's eyes. He looked like a convicted felon, he said later. Finally, when both men were ready, Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, shouted, "Present!" What happened next, and in what order, was bitterly contested by those present and has been argued about for 2 centuries. What is certain is this: Aaron Burr leveled his Wagden dueling pistol at Alexander Hamilton and pulled the trigger. A .50 caliber lead ball left the muzzle at a speed of 545 miles per hour, traversed the distance between the two men in less than a 20th of a second, pierced Hamilton's abdomen, struck a bone, ricocheted into his liver, and mortally wounded him. And there, I've done it. I've given away the ending of my book. Now you know. This is a murder mystery in which there's no mystery at all about who pulled the trigger. We know that Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. The mystery is in the why. The mystery is in the hearts of these two men. 1 week before, 7 days before this happened, they sat side by side at Fraunces Tavern in New York City for a gala July 4th dinner. And there were toasts and songs and jests, and the rum punch and Madeira flowed like water. And there they were, the sitting Vice President of the United States and the former Secretary of the Treasury, to all the world enjoying themselves at this convivial affair, and giving no hint that they had already set in motion their murderous plan to meet on the dueling ground. So how could this be? How could they sit side by side calmly and yet be so filled with rage that they were determined to shoot it out a few days later? Which is what we all want to know, right? And what makes the story even more interesting is that in Burr and Hamilton, we have two complex characters whose differences capture the conflicts that beset the young nation and raging conflicts that we still are dealing with today. So from my point of view, the best way to understand this story is not to start with who fired first or exactly what led to the duel, but to go back 30 years to the beginning of their relationship and trace the rivalry to see what set them on this slow motion collision course. And that's what I've tried to do in my book, Rivals Unto Death, and what I want to touch on tonight. So thank you so much for being here. We were worried that the snow was going to hold people up, but luckily there wasn't very much of it. So I'm very pleased that we have such a robust audience here tonight. I have a question for you guys. Help me out here. How many of you have seen the musical Hamilton? Raise your hands. Okay. Keep them up in the air, please. Okay. How many of you have listened up? Keep it up. Listened to the soundtrack of Hamilton? We have a few more. Okay. Keep them all up, please. How many of you have vaguely heard that there's some show called Hamilton out there? Okay. I think we've got, wow. Okay. So I was worried about you there for a moment, sir. And we've all been touched by the Hamilton phenomenon, or the Haminomenon, as I have taken to calling it. There's no escaping it. My wife Marilyn and I saw the show last year in Chicago. We absolutely loved it. But when it comes to history versus Hamilton, it's important to remember this. The show is a complex weaving of fact and fiction that makes up a lot of stuff and leaves a lot of stuff out. Like the Whiskey Rebellion, or the Alien and Sedition Acts, or that time that Burr fought a duel with Alexander Hamilton's brother-in-law, or that time that Burr saved Alexander Hamilton's life. Or, well, okay, you get the idea. But the great thing about the musical, from my point of view, is that it has inspired this desire to know the real story. People, if you'll pardon me quoting from the musical, people want to be in the room where it happened. They want to understand it. And also, in a very real way, this musical inspired this book. This book was inspired, it owes its existence to Lin-Manuel Miranda and the musical. The book also avenges a wrong inadvertently done to me by Richard Dreyfuss some years ago, and it allows me to name drop two great celebrities who I've never met. So here's the story. I started my career as a journalist, a radio TV reporter, a TV news producer, and then I became co-owner of an ad agency, and I finally, at age 40 or so, found my calling making films and writing books about my great passion, history. And honestly, I've considered myself all the way through that I've been a journalist and a storyteller, and I still am today. And as an author, I got my start writing a series of books called The Greatest Stories Never Told. Each one has 100 stories from history to astonish, bewilder, and stupefy. The only book in print, I think, with the word stupefy in the title. So a couple of years ago, with Hamilton the hottest ticket in town, the editor, who had been the editor of that first book series, now he's a publisher, and he called me up and he asked me if I would be interested in writing a short book about Hamilton and Burr to kind of provide a vivid introduction to the story to people who really didn't know much about it. Now, I don't know how much you guys know about publishing, but usually it's the writer desperately pitching the publisher to do a book. So if the publisher calls you up and says, would you be interested in writing a book, there's really only one good answer, which is yes. So I took the job. And the publisher had a hurry-up deadline, but I had an ace up my sleeve because about a dozen years ago or so, I was supposed to make a documentary about this topic for the History Channel. And I had started working, I'd started interviewing people, I was getting forward, moving on it, and then it turned out we just hadn't quite signed that contract yet. And then it turned out that Richard Dreyfuss wanted to make a documentary program about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And for some reason or other, they went with Richard Dreyfuss instead of me. I mean, can you believe it? I mean, go figure. But the good news for me was then that when this project came around, I had already done some of the research, I had read some of the books, I kind of had a head start and I was ready to go. And I needed it because with a 120-day deadline and a 200-page limit, this was going to be an effort to do quickly. And it clearly wasn't going to be an exhaustive history. But those limits also helped me focus on the things that people are most interested in, the good stuff, if you will. And my goal was to bring to vivid life the most important elements of the story. And I had two other goals as well as I started the book. And one was to take the founders off the pedestal. Sometimes when we think of the Founding Fathers, we conjure up an image like this one. This is a painting that depicts Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and others presenting their draft of the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. And in this painting, the founders stand there. They are formal and dignified, great men thinking deep thoughts about to do something solemn and important for America. And I think this is a terribly misleading image. These guys were not statues. They were flesh and blood human beings. And robing them in marble robs them of their humanity. This was a pretty fractious bunch filled with ambition and jealousy and anger and ego, and that's how I wanted to portray them in this book. You know, we don't always think of George Washington cursing a blue streak like he did at the Battle of Monmouth, where one officer said he looked like a thundercloud before the lightning flash. And we don't often think about Thomas Jefferson whining about the length of speeches other people, Alexander Hamilton, are making at cabinet meetings. And we don't necessarily think of John Adams making the kind of caustic and vulgar remarks that he made about Alexander Hamilton, blaming Hamilton's behavior on, and I'm quoting here, a superabundance of excretions which he could not find whores enough to draw off. That is President John Adams. We have a president now who does some outrageous things on Twitter sometimes. I do believe John Adams could give him a run for his money. And Adams is one of 5 presidents who are characters in this book. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. 4 of them get into a shouting match before the book is over, and the 5th one, James Madison, earns the nickname the Big Knife for his ability to cut deals. So these guys were very human, warts and all, no different than you and I in many respects. And that is, to me, such a cool thing. This is not kind of deus ex machina, where the gods lowered down some amazing heroes, immortals, to take care of things on earth. These were smart people, yes, but regular people, flawed in many ways, and yet they came together to found our country. The other thing that I wanted to do, as you already know because I went forward one extra slide, I wanted to try to be objective. History and popular culture have made Burr the cardboard cutout villain in this story. Almost everybody who writes about this takes a side, and most of them take Alexander Hamilton's side. And Burr is portrayed as one of the twin bad boys of early American history, along with Benedict Arnold. If you want a good conspiracy theory, by the way, at age 19, Aaron Burr was an aide to Benedict Arnold when they were invading Quebec. But so Burr's always made out to be the bad guy. One author put it this way. He said, history has tagged Aaron Burr as a scoundrel, and history has it right. But if we start off by viewing Burr as the villain and Hamilton as the hero, everything has to fit that narrative. And it just isn't really that simple. Because just because Hamilton was a visionary doesn't make Burr a villain. So I thought it was important not to go into the story with the idea expressed by this particular author, even though, oops, oh, I'm having trouble tonight, even though I am that author, okay? So yeah, I went into this with some biases, but I tried to put them aside and approach Burr as an objective reporter. And in fact, Aaron Burr was a war hero, he was a feminist, he was an abolitionist, he was a supporter of immigrant rights, far more so than immigrant Alexander Hamilton. He was a loving husband and father. He was a patron of the arts. He was a brilliant political innovator. So admirable in many ways, up to a point. And in the end, I just thought giving Burr his due made for a better story. And that's what I tried to do. So, okay, so the book that I wrote, Rivals Unto Death, really focuses on the interactions between these two, and it's structured as a countdown. So the chapters are numbered backward. They start from 10 and go down to 1. For each chapter, I say how many years are left until the duel. There was a reviewer on Goodreads, you know the internet site Goodreads for books, and somebody on there made a comment. They said, at first I thought it was a mistake, and then I thought, maybe he did it on purpose. So I do just want to confirm that I did this on purpose. And my thinking was that, this is a story with a time bomb under the table. And that time bomb is ticking. And I never really want readers to forget that this is ticking down to the explosion at the end. So, okay, let's talk about these two men. Both were orphans, but they came from very different backgrounds. Alexander Hamilton came from the Caribbean island of Nevis. His mother never married his father. She died when he was 13 years old. He came to New York as an impoverished youth at age 18 and started studying at what is now Columbia. And believe me when I tell you, I have collapsed into a very short sentence, a tale of horror of Alexander Hamilton's young life. It is incredible that he even grew to adulthood, never mind that he made it eventually off Nevis and made it to the United States, what is now the United States. Burr, on the other hand, was born into a prominent family. His maternal grandfather was the famous preacher and theologian Jonathan Edwards. His father, also named Aaron Burr, was the president of what is now Princeton University. But his parents died when he was an infant. Also, he was raised by an uncle, and he graduated from Princeton at age 16. More common then than it is now to graduate from Princeton at age 16, but still not always the most common thing. So there are two prodigies, two young men in a hurry. And it's not clear exactly when they first met, but their lives start to intertwine during the Revolution. They both become officers in the Continental Army. And the first time that I can ascertain that they're in the same place at the same time is on September 15th, 1776, during one of the most desperate hours of the Battle of New York. Now, how many of you, by a show of hands, consider yourselves familiar with the Battle of New York? Okay, we got one. I got to tell you, that's one more than usual, okay? Even when we did this talk at France's Tavern in New York City, I think we only got 2 or 3 people. The Battle of New York is the biggest battle in the American Revolution. 35,000 British soldiers and seamen versus a ragtag army of 20 or 25,000 under George Washington clash in New York in the summer and fall of 1776. And it starts in Brooklyn, and it goes across into Manhattan, and up into Harlem, and into Westchester, and then eventually across the river into New Jersey. So why is it that none of us know anything about the Battle of New York? Well, you can tell. Oh, so somebody said? We lost, right? We lost. We got creamed. Washington's army wasn't even decimated. It was 5 times decimated at this battle. And so we like to remember the Battle of Trenton, or the Battle of Saratoga, where not very many people were involved, but we won. In the Battle of New York, on this particular day, September 15, 1776, the British have invaded Manhattan. They've landed in Kips Bay, around where 34th Street is now. And Washington tries to rally the troops at a spot near where the New York Public Library now stands. That's a call out to our library director there, on 42nd Street. But his panicked militia flies up north to Harlem. And Washington is so enraged and disgusted, he flings his hat down on the ground. He says, "Good God, have I got such troops as these?" He cannot believe he can win the revolution with these guys. And by late afternoon, virtually all of the American troops have left Manhattan, except one small contingent manning a fort near what is modern-day Chinatown. And the commander of this small contingent is determined to fight it out to the death. But Aaron Burr, as a young staff officer, convinces him to retreat. He actually refuses. Burr says, really you should join everybody else. You should join Washington. No, we're going to fight to the death. So Burr rides off, and he comes back again about 10 minutes later, and he goes, "Well, I have just brought orders for you I talked to General Washington, and he says you must come." "Okay, well, if I have orders, we'll go up north." So why is this important? It's important because one of the officers in that contingent was Alexander Hamilton. So if Burr does not convince the commander of that group to rejoin Washington up in Harlem, they are probably going to be killed or taken prisoner. And most of the prisoners ended up dying on prison ships. So Alexander Hamilton probably would have died. Aaron Burr saved his life on that day. Something you will not find in the musical Hamilton, okay? Let me just say.
To avoid situations where Hamilton lost, that's why he didn't put the slavery rap in.
There you go. So we have Jocelyn has memorized the musical and is very familiar with the backstory. If I get in trouble, she's coming up and taking over for me.
No.
Art can help her out too, because he's got this stuff down as well. So Hamilton and Burr are each offered a chance to serve on Washington's staff during the Revolution. Burr is offered a position in 1776, just before the Battle of New York, when he was 20 years old. Hamilton the following year when he was 22. Think how young they are. 20 and 22 serving on the general staff. And it's startling how different their experiences were. Burr lasted 10 days on Washington's staff and left with a bitter taste in his mouth and a lifelong enmity towards George Washington. Alexander Hamilton spent 4 years on Washington's staff, became his most important aide and his protege. And over the years, I think this fundamental divide over Washington helped shape their politics and sour their relationship. Hamilton thought that Washington was one of the greatest men who ever lived, and Burr once said, I love this quote, that he, quote, despised Washington as a man of no talents and one who could not spell a sentence of common English. That's a little harsh, I think. But these opinions push them in different directions. So Hamilton, becomes a Federalist. He believes in a big central government because he saw how much it hurt Washington not to have a strong central government supporting him during the Revolution. Burr goes into the opposite camp, into what they call the Democrat-Republican Party. Well, I will refer to here, and they often refer to it as the Republican Party, but it's very different than today's Republican Party. But he's sort of in the opposition to this big central government party. And the mutual antagonism between the two of them resurfaces again and again over the years and sort of drives a wedge between them. So after the war in 1783, they both go into law practice in New York City. And it's a real different New York City than we know today. It's completely different. First of all, the city has about 15,000 people living in it. It ends at what is now Houston Street. None of the numbered streets even exist yet. That's all farmland. And my favorite statistic to understand how small New York is at this time is that it has about a dozen lawyers in all of New York City. You can go into a Starbucks on Wall Street now and have a dozen lawyers ordering coffee right there. But there's about a dozen lawyers in the whole city, including Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So of course they know each other. They're in the courtrooms together. They're in the drawing rooms of the city at night. They broke bread at each other's table. But they presented quite a contrast. So Burr was pretty casual, almost careless about the way he dressed and groomed, didn't pay a lot of attention to it. He had kind of a look described in the book as elegant nonchalance. And Hamilton is completely different. He said that smart clothes were essential. That's a quote. He wore elegant suits, some of them ordered from a French tailor, not a French trailer. And this is great. He had his hair, according to his son, he had his hair groomed by a hairdresser every day, as I'm sure most of you do as well. Looking out, I see that. So they also had very different styles in the courtroom, and let me read you a brief excerpt about that. Let me get the right page first. There we go. Hamilton was combative in court, wearing down the other side with beautifully realized but lengthy arguments. He was already exhibiting the take no prisoners style that was to alienate so many. He was not content with knocking his opponent on the head, said his friend and fellow attorney Robert Troup, but persisted until he had banished every insect that buzzed around the ears. The urbane Burr tended to be more persuasive, tapping into the emotions of jurors. He was also much briefer in his delivery. Burr would say as much in half an hour as Hamilton in 2 hours, said one observer who knew and admired them both. Attorney John Van Ness Yates, watching them both in court one day, said that Hamilton appealed to the head while Burr enslaved the heart. Hamilton himself was fascinated and at the same time perplexed by Burr's courtroom performances. He found Burr's style concise and pleasing, but added, "When I analyzed his arguments, I could never discern in what his greatness consisted." So here you have two young men in New York. They're both lawyers. They're both on the rise. Hamilton, of course, becomes the primary author behind the Federalist Papers, arguing on behalf of the Constitution, becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury. Aaron Burr becomes the Attorney General from New York State, and then goes on to become a United States Senator from New York. And so there's things pulling them apart, there's things bringing them together, and it seems kind of like a normal political relationship. But when Aaron Burr runs for vice president in 1792, Hamilton doesn't just oppose him, he goes ballistic. And let me again read so that I can really quote and tell you exactly what I'm talking about. Hamilton's rage exploded onto the page in an extended rant he shared privately with his closest allies. Burr, he said, was unprincipled, both as a public and private man. He is for or against nothing, but as it suits his interest or ambition. He is determined, as I conceive, said Hamilton, to make his way to be the head of the popular party and to climb to the highest honors of the state and as much higher as circumstances may permit. Burr, he said, was trying to play the game of confusion, and I feel it a religious duty to oppose his career. Now, this is 12 years before they fight the duel at Weehawken. And already Hamilton is saying that he has a religious duty to oppose Burr. So what happened? Well, first of all, when Burr ran for senator, he defeated Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler. So that was a betrayal as far as Hamilton was concerned. But there's also something a lot deeper here. Hamilton, I think, viewed politics as kind of a sacred mission. He had fixed principles that he fought for with all the passion he could muster. And Burr saw politics as a career, as something to do well in, to try to achieve what you could, you know, and kind of make a mark, but his allegiances were a lot more flexible. And when Hamilton looked at Burr, he saw a man with no fixed ideology other than winning. And I think that this earned Burr a kind of special scorn in Hamilton's pantheon of villains. Burr, on the other hand, saw Hamilton as a fanatic warped by zealotry, allied with his old enemy Washington and somebody who kept getting in his way. So here we are. We're 12 years before the duel. And from then on, they were implacable enemies until that morning at Weehawken. Except, no, actually that's not true at all. And one of the most fascinating parts of this story is, despite the strong differences between them, a few years later, they seemed tantalizingly close to becoming allies. And to tell you about that, I want to fast forward to a scene in 1797. It's 7 years to the day before the duel between Hamilton and Burr, in which Hamilton is getting into a dust-up with another founding father, this fellow right here. On Tuesday morning, July 11th, 1797, Hamilton was trembling with rage. The target of his anger was future President James Monroe, who had just returned from Europe upon being recalled as minister to France. When Hamilton accused Monroe of being a liar, the Virginian became equally incensed. The two men leapt out of their chairs and began screaming at each other. "Do you say I represented falsely? You are a scoundrel," Monroe shouted. "I will meet you like a gentleman," Hamilton fired back. "I am ready. Get your pistols." Anger management, people. I think that's some issues there. The subject of Hamilton and Monroe's argument was America's first great political sex scandal. Alexander Hamilton had an affair with a young married woman named Maria Reynolds, whose husband, James Reynolds, then began blackmailing Hamilton over the affair. Probably with the knowledge, certainly with the knowledge and probably with the consent of his wife. A charming couple, the Reynolds, wonderful footnote characters to American history. And we know all about this affair. We know about it in detail. And why do we know about it? Because Alexander Hamilton, in his wisdom, wrote a 90-page treatise about it, which has gone down in history as being the Reynolds pamphlet. And he did this to prove Yes, I'm guilty of having an affair, but I was not engaged in a corruption scheme with James Reynolds, which is what he was accused of. So he writes this pamphlet. Well, it goes over about as well as you would expect, okay? It is not a big hit with the American public. People are laughing at Alexander Hamilton. One editor, James Callender, said that Hamilton's argument boiled down to this: because I am a rake, therefore I cannot be a thief. So, you know, they say nowadays it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Honestly, I think Hamilton should have covered up a little more. And for reasons that I detail in the book, Hamilton blames Monroe for news of this affair getting out. And Monroe denies it, and it looks like they're going to be having a duel. And so Monroe naturally tries to find somebody to be his second for the duel. And who do you think he asks? Pardon? Aaron Burr. So this is a delicious irony, because both Monroe and Hamilton at various times have suggested that Burr's not trustworthy, and now he holds both of their lives in his hands. And astonishingly, Burr manages to untangle things and avoid a duel, which Hamilton appreciates. And now suddenly there's a new rapprochement, and they're kind of buddy-buddy. They're serving on committees together. Hamilton tries to get Burr a job as a quartermaster general of a new army that's forming in case we go to war with France. Washington puts the nix on it, but think how history would have been different if that had happened, if it had worked out. And don't take my word for it. Here's what John Adams had to say. What would have been the consequence of Hamilton and Burr being friends and working together? Shall I say that Hamilton would have been now alive, and Hamilton and Burr now at the head of our affairs? What then? And the president's sage words, I think, are something to ponder. So as the book counts down towards the duel, the presidential election of 1800 looms quite large, since it comes just 4 years before the duel at Weehawken, and it once again sets Hamilton and Burr in opposition. Now, let me set the scene. The incumbent president in this election is John Adams. He's brilliant, he's crotchety, he's difficult, and he and the Federalists are now brandishing the Alien and Sedition Acts to crush dissent. Literally, congressmen and newspaper editors who are spokesmen for the Republican Party are being locked up in jail for criticizing the president and his policies. Freedom of the press is under assault. And Federalist zeal in these prosecutions knew no bounds. One case involved a couple of tipplers outside a tavern in Newark, New Jersey. It's always in New Jersey, right? Who were amused by the spectacle of the 16-gun salute being fired as President Adams' carriage drives by. There goes the president, and they are firing at his ass, bellowed Brown Clark, one of the men. I don't care if they fire through his ass, responds his drinking companion, which is ho, 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 ha, ha, ha. Both men go to jail for those remarks. So that is the tenor of the times in 1800. And Republicans think if Adams wins re-election, it's going to lead to tyranny and one-party rule. So they put up their best man, Thomas Jefferson. And the Federalists basically think that if Jefferson wins, that he is going to bring the French Revolution to America. There's going to be blood in the streets. It's going to be tearing the country to shreds. I did most of the writing of this book in the summer of 2016, when, if you can think back that far, you may recall there was another presidential election. And it was a weird and intense experience to be mentally immersed in the election of 1800 while watching the events of the election of 2016 go by, because there seemed to be a lot of parallels to me. And I'm not sure which one was kind of wilder. Literally not sure, in that when I wrote the first draft of this book, which I had to hand in on September 1st of 2016, I referred to the election of 1800 as the wildest election in American history. And when I handed in the revisions, which was, I think, 4 weeks later, I had changed that to one of the wildest elections in American history, because I felt that the election going on then might prove to be the wildest. But I'm not exaggerating. I want to, again, give you a sense of exactly what I'm talking about. The fervent belief that so much was at stake, indeed, that the fate of the nation might be in peril, fueled unparalleled personal attacks and stirred deep-seated paranoia. President Adams was decried as a warmonger, a tyrant, a criminal. Republican editor James Callender mocked him as a poor old man and a hideous hermaphroditical character. Jefferson was labeled it was a happier, simpler time, right? Jefferson was labeled an atheist, and apocalyptic prophecies were made about a Jefferson presidency. Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will all be openly taught and practiced, predicted the Connecticut Current, a newspaper which is still published today as the Hartford Current. The air will be rent with the cries of distress, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Reverend Thomas Dwight, the president of Yale, blustered that under a Jefferson presidency, we may see the Bible cast into the bonfire. We may see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution. Housewives in New England, it is said, buried their Bibles in the gardens, convinced that as president, Jefferson would confiscate and burn them. I don't know if any of you live in an old house. You might want to go check in the garden, make sure there's no old Bible buried there. Might be valuable. So let me shortcut to the end. This election ends in a tie. But the tie is not between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. As American history fans know, the tie is between Thomas Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr. Because due to a quirk in the Constitution, the way it was originally written, the votes for president and the votes for vice president basically count as exactly the same, and they're tied. And they each have 73 electoral votes. So the race goes to the House of Representatives. Now, virtually every single Federalist in Congress prefers Aaron Burr to Thomas Jefferson. Virtually every Federalist in the country prefers Burr to Jefferson. Jefferson is Satan. He is Satan. Burr is a guy maybe we can kind of deal with. So the Federalists are all voting for Burr. The Republicans are all voting for Jefferson. And it's a tie in the House of Representatives for 30 ballots. They're voting by state. I lay it all out in the book, but it's a tie. 30 ballots. Of course, there's one prominent Federalist in America who takes a different position, and you know who it is. It's Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton is no friend of Jefferson's. He has been an enemy of Jefferson's for a long time. They had tangled first when they were in the cabinet together. They have been very much political enemies. And in fact, 4 years earlier, in the election of 1796, Hamilton had written, all personal and partial considerations must be discarded, and everything must give way to the great object of excluding Jefferson. But that's 1796. That's 4 years ago. This is 1800. Things are very different, and its politics were kind of flexible. So now Hamilton is saying in 1800, there is no doubt that upon every virtuous and prudent calculation, Jefferson is to be preferred. He is by far not so dangerous a man. And this is the message he is sending out in great detail and at great length, privately, again, to every other Federalist. And eventually his words help convince a key Federalist to change his vote, and Jefferson is elected on the 33rd ballot. And while Hamilton's attacks were in private letters, it is impossible for me to believe that he didn't hear about this, that word didn't reach him about this. But it wasn't Burr's style to complain. He's not the kind of guy who would get angry and post on Facebook. Hamilton's totally that guy. He's like going to argue back, argue. Burr's going to wait for time. Hamilton is fire, Burr is ice. Great quote from a Philadelphia newspaper about Burr. While others debate, he resolves. While others resolve, he acts. Burr's icy resolve was to prove fatal to Alexander Hamilton 3 years after Jefferson's inauguration. And a lot happens in that 3 years. A bitter governor's race, New York's so-called pamphlet wars. But for now, let's fast forward one more time to that day of reckoning, July 11th, 1804. And when it comes to the duel, I think the question that most people ask is who fired first? And I think the reason that this is a burning question for people is it serves as a proxy for another question. Whose fault was it? Who do we blame? Did Aaron Burr murder Alexander Hamilton in cold blood? Or did Hamilton fire first and then just justify Burr's response? And as I've said, I don't think you can. I think you have to go back 30 years and see the whole relationship. You have to buy the book to really understand it, I guess is what my argument comes down to. But I think you have to understand the whole context of this ongoing fighting for any of this duel to make sense when you finally get there. Nevertheless, the question of who fired first is certainly loaded with significance, if you'll pardon the pun. So let's take a look at it. There are 4 people present for the duel. There's 5 in this picture, but the real story is that there's 4 because the doctor who is there is down below and he does not witness the actual duel. The only people who are there witnessing it are Hamilton and Burr and their 2 seconds, the second being their assistant, essentially, their aide for the duel. One of those people is mortally wounded and doesn't really give a full coherent account of what happened. And from the accounts of the other 3 people come 2 diametrically opposed stories. Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, emphatically declared that Burr fired first and that Hamilton only fired as an involuntary reflex when Burr's musket ball struck him in the side. Burr and his second, William Van Ness, were equally emphatic in saying that Hamilton fired first and Burr didn't return fire until a few minutes later. So that's the eyewitness accounts. Where does that leave us? Tied, right? So what other factors should we look into? Well, there's a bunch of them that you can take a look at, and I outline them in the book, and here are 2. First of all, Hamilton told his second, and also wrote in a letter to his wife, that he was not going to fire first, but that he was going to throw away his shot. It pleases God to give me the opportunity to reserve and throw away my fire, and I have thoughts of even reserving my second fire. And he's doing this in part, if you read what he wrote in the night before, he's doing this in part because he feels a little guilty. He feels like maybe his provocations really were enough to drive Burr to this, that he's not blameless in it, so he's not willing to shoot Burr first. But 2 things. One is, it's one thing to say, I'm not going to fire, I am going to throw away my shot the night before. It's another thing when somebody is pointing a pistol at you from 30 feet away. Honestly, it's not loaded, okay? It's not even a real pistol, so don't worry. I have had people panic in this moment, so I don't want to go there. But you might, in the adrenaline of the moment, you might suddenly say, I'm going with a new plan, fire, okay? The second thing is, and I think this is really important, Burr never said publicly, Hamilton. Hamilton never said publicly that he was going to throw away his shot. So Burr would have no way of knowing that he was saying he was going to do that. That would not be a fact he was coming to the dueling ground with. The second factor that I think is very important is the incident with the glasses. Just before the duel is about to start, oh, come on. Just before the duel is about to start, just before Nathaniel Pendleton shouts, present, Hamilton calls out, stop! And everyone is startled, and they look at him, and he says, in certain states of the light, one requires glasses. And then he goes through this, it's almost a pantomime. I mean, it's an act. He's not wearing glasses at the time. I can no longer see anything, just so you know. And he takes the glasses out of his pocket, his spectacles, and he starts aiming with and without. Okay, I'm not sure which is better, without the glasses, checking it out. Eventually he says that he's going to wear his glasses. This will do now. He says, you may proceed. And then they go ahead with the duel. Now, if you're Aaron Burr, and he's going through this act with you at the other end, what do you think his intentions are? it would seem like his intentions were to fire with deadly aim. And so if you were Aaron Burr, you might be pretty resolved that you were going to try to fire back or be as deadly as Hamilton seemed to be being towards you. So even if Burr did fire first, he might have felt that was the only way to defend himself. And there are other factors here, I think, that come into play, or they come into play if you're trying to analyze this. There's the hair trigger. Some of you may know about the hair triggers on the pistols. There's the comments, the fragmentary comments that Hamilton made in the 24 hours after this, before he died. There's the exchange of notes between the 2 seconds that continues for several weeks and provides some perspective. And I lay all of this out in the book and try to let people make their own conclusions. More than 2 centuries after the fact, my opinion is that there's no way to know for sure, to say definitely this happened exactly this way. And I think when you run into somebody who has a really strong opinion, they're sure so-and-so fired first, or they're sure so-and-so is at fault, I think it reflects their opinion of the two men. If you're a fan of Hamilton, you definitely think Burr fired first, and vice versa. Not long ago, I stayed with some friends in New York who have an 11th grade daughter, and during her teenage years, she's been caught up in her own world. I've been able barely to get a bored hello in from her when I go to visit. And this last time was very different, because I mentioned that I had finished this book on Hamilton and Burr, and suddenly she wanted to talk about it. She wanted to ask questions. We talked for 20 minutes until she had to leap up from the breakfast table and go to school because she was late. She was entranced by the show. She wanted to know everything she could about the real story. Best of all, she was now moving on. Her class was studying Andrew Jackson, and she was trying to kind of find out more about Andrew Jackson because now she realized that history could be interesting, and a flame had really been lit. And I think that is the great thing about this story. It's the great thing about the play as well. This piece of history is quite relevant today. Many of the issues that these guys were dealing with are identical to issues we deal with today. Big government versus small government, elites versus the common people, national debt, immigration, the Electoral College. These are the stuff that Hamilton and Burr and their contemporaries argued about. They're still things we're arguing about today. The story of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr is an inspiration, a warning, a tragedy, a murder mystery, and a primer on early America. It's a story that has it all: sex, violence, jealousy, guys wearing wigs. It's vastly entertaining, but it's also illuminating, I think. It sheds an illuminating light on our country and ourselves. It's been a great pleasure to try to distill this big story into this small book, and also to share it with you tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Are we going
much.
to do a question and answer period?
You are the boss.
Wonderful. All right. So thank you so much for staying, and we welcome you to ask questions. And I'm going to
Take your phone. I've been reading your very interesting text that you've been getting. So. Do we have any questions?
Do you take checks for the book? Just how much do I have to write a check out for?
Yes, and $15. Make it out to Plate of Peas Productions. I'll explain later. But yes, I absolutely do. Okay, and that's for anybody else as well. And we take credit cards too. So other questions that don't have to do with that. Okay, Paul.
Just kind of a comment. When you were talking about the Battle of New York,
Yes.
and the fact that it was a losing battle, we have our own losing battle that we celebrate up here. The Battle of Bunker Hill, and that was one of the big losses. And I guess all the other ones, when they teach the revolution around here, kind of take a back seat to that one.
Well, that's an interesting point. And actually, we used to live in Lexington, and the Battle of Lexington is not exactly a huge victory when viewed by itself, since 8 men were killed in Lexington, 8 militia and no British soldiers, but then we combine it with Concord and then we're winners, so that feels good. And the thing about the Battle of Bunker Hill that's interesting is that it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory for the British, because they do drive the colonials off the hill and take possession of the hill, but they lose, I think, something like 1,000 men killed. And this is really, it's said by historians that the British generals who were in command that day, who go on to be in command at other times during the Revolution, never lost the memory of Bunker Hill. They were always a little bit afraid to commit their troops in the sort of the frontal assaults that cost them so much at Bunker Hill. So it was a defeat for the colonials, but it also was a defeat for the British really as well. I think in the Battle of New York, if I remember, Washington goes into it with 20,000 troops and goes out of it with about 2,000. I mean, everybody else is killed, captured, or intelligent, and flees to the hills to get out of Dodge before they get zapped themselves. Somebody else? Jocelyn?
I was wondering, how big a part did Lafayette play in Hamilton's life?
Lafayette and Hamilton were definitely friends. They definitely, definitely were close. Hamilton was a very fluent French speaker, which is one of the reasons he was so useful to Washington. They were perhaps not quite as close as they were portrayed in the play, but they were definitely good friends and allies. And Lafayette was just distraught when Hamilton was killed, and he wrote a letter to Jefferson saying, "Oh, whatever your political differences, you must be distraught and heartbroken as well." And Jefferson basically put that in his aside, didn't respond to it, never commented on it. He was not very distraught that Hamilton was dead at all. Anybody else? Art?
In your research, did you actually get to look at the letters that were preserved, and where are those letters located?
So I did not look at the physical letters that are preserved, and they're on all different places. What I was able to do, which was tremendously valuable to me in writing in a short period of time, is that there's a resource that the Library of Congress has, archives.founders.gov, I think is the website, which has virtually all of the letters and documents written by the first 5 presidents and Alexander Hamilton. And they may be adding other stuff too, and I cannot remember how many tens or hundreds of thousands of letters this is, but it's also all word searchable. So it's really useful for a couple of things, and date searchable, and searchable in every way you can imagine. So I can look for any letters between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, and there are some. You can look for, you can say, I want to see everything that everybody wrote in, let's say July 1804 when the duel was. You can also, what I found, so if you're going through a secondary source, like if you're reading Ron Chernow's book, or if you're reading a book about Burr and you see a quote, you can take that quote, plug it in, and now you can actually find the original letter and read the whole letter and not be stuck with just the other historian's interpretation of that, but you can look at it yourself and see the context of it. And I found this to be a tremendously valuable resource. The internet is an astonishing tool for good and evil. You know, we hear every day about the way it's a tool for misinformation and stealing data and all sorts of stuff, but there is a tremendous amount of well-sourced, real historical information at your fingertips. It's not terribly hard to find. And for example, I always like to include the weather when I'm writing about history, because I think that helps make it more real. If you say it was a sultry morning, or it was a bitter cold, or whatever it was. But I don't like to make it up, because that's not my business. I'm not a novelist. I'm not making stuff up. So I'm always looking for people's diaries, because there might be a diarist who It has nothing to do with your story, but they're in the same place, and diarists of this time often would say, you know, weather sunny and cool, or weather, you know, rainstorms in the afternoon or something. And I found, you know, searching, I wanted to figure out what the weather was for all the days leading up to the duel and for the duel itself. And there was a young woman in New York, and her name is escaping me right now, but she had a diary that she kept, and it was online at the New York Historical Society. And so I was able to go in and not only from that get the weather for each of the days as I'm doing this countdown, but then she also talked about, as news is spreading in New York, about the death of Hamilton and kind of giving you a real sense of that. There's just volumes of cool stuff that's at your fingertips without, even though going to an archive is amazing, I love doing that, but it's also fantastic that you can find so much of it right at your fingertips. I hope that kind of answered your question. I'll go over to you.
Were duels legal, and what did the public think about Burr after? Was he considered like a murderer? Or
Were they common?
Pardon?
Were they common?
So three different questions there. So duels were not legal.
Oh.
They were not legal. They were illegal both in New York and New Jersey. There's a line in the play. They say everything's legal in New Jersey, but they were illegal in both states. They were not uncommon. Especially they were generally fought among people who you would call gentlemen, if you will, which means people sort of property and money generally. And they often they were much more common among people who had been military officers. Okay, this really came out of the military culture in some ways. And dueling kind of was not terribly uncommon. And there are other instances that I talk about in the book of other duels that are going on involving Continental Army officers, involving a newspaper editor in New York shooting somebody dead. In this case, it's very interesting. Hamilton was kind of, at the time, the day before he died, Alexander Hamilton was a problem for the Federalists and a problem for the other party. He had everybody sort of hating him all at once. The day after he died, he's a martyr to everybody. He's very useful to them because now, and of course the Federalists have no use for Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson also has decided he has no use for Aaron Burr. And so now everybody can be on the Burr lynching party together. So Burr is quite surprised to find himself very quickly reviled over this. He's taken aback by it, which is not necessarily the normal reaction in duels. Oftentimes it is understood that they were meeting on the field of honor and what happens, happens. But Burr decides that he should get out of town. So he heads down south to Georgia, where he is, in fact, applauded by people for having shot Alexander Hamilton, in part. He got what he deserved, kind of thing. He's indicted in both New York and New Jersey, but in neither case does he ever come to trial. He is, please keep in mind, the sitting Vice President of the United States. He goes back to Washington eventually once the heat dies down, and he actually presides over an impeachment trial in the Senate, an impeachment of a federal judge, and it's one of the earliest impeachment trials, and he sets a lot of precedents that become used in other trials and is generally praised for his handling of this trial. Jefferson had already decided to run with somebody else, so when his term is up, he's no longer vice president, and then he goes on to his great Western adventure, which leads him to be charged with treason a few years later by Thomas Jefferson. So that's a story that gets half a page at the end of my book, because it's not really what it's about, but it's a whole fascinating quagmire of a story all on its own. Anybody else? Yeah, we can have time for one or two more.
You're working on a project now?
I am. So some of you have met my wife, Marilyn Ray Byer, who's sitting here, and some of you haven't met her. But we are working on a book together, and it is another Revolutionary War story. And we have sent the chapter outline to the publisher. So we hope that they didn't ask us to do this one. So now we're in the position of the writers pleading to publish our book. And it's the story of a magazine full of gunpowder on the island of Bermuda, and all the people who are trying to get it, including Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and Abraham Whipple, a fantastic privateer out of Rhode Island, the commander of the Rhode Island Navy, you'll be happy to know, in 1776, and two prominent families on Bermuda who are coming to blows over this. It's a very little known story, and this powder proves very important later in both for George Washington in command of the Continental Army here, and also in some battles further in the South. And that is a story that we have wanted to write for 20 years, and so we are working on it now. So,
in doing some research for that story, I found that I was reading handwritten documents from the 1700s telling stories about the actual pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh, you're kidding.
Because that's how some of the gunpowder came to be on Bermuda. So it's
yeah, this is one where we have gone to the archives and literally been paging through the minutes of the Bermuda Executive Council in 1775.
Really nice handwriting, fortunately.
Really nice. And you know, if you're gonna see, if you're gonna write a book, find some place that you really want to go, right? And oh yeah, we've got to make another trip to Bermuda. So research. It's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. Guys, I'm going to say thank you very much. I am here if you have any more questions, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I would be more than delighted to sell you a book. And if you've already bought one, Art, you can buy one for a friend. So anyway, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I appreciate it. And thank you, Andrea. Thank you.